It's got Olean superimposed on Jamestown. Don't know. Usually I would get like the 3.
Right, well, that's because we have to end this call and redial because they dropped their Dunkirk connection.
Bastards,
That's right.
pardon my language.
But that's fine, we're gonna let that run,
Okay.
but we're gonna let this,
One more reason to be mad at my math college.
Stan went up there to go straighten him around. But yeah, you were right.
Well, because Chris was in the room and that was fine, but then Amber kept popping in from 294.
She wanted to connect with 116, but she's
Right.
supposed to connect with 110.
Right. Chaos, I think.
It's chaos.
Now it looks normal. So, I don't know. Oh, there we are. There's Olean. Oh, there's Dunker. So now we should be all right.
Because I don't see any Dunkirk students.
Well, I don't. I only have the 1.
Okay.
So
I'm just gonna double check your room, that's what I had, but you had your
163,
163,
116. No, we had it right.
and she's like,
They had it wrong. And I kept saying you could stay for class, but they didn't take me up on that. So I'd rather be in this class than go to a math meeting, but.
All right, you're all
All
set.
right,
You
thank you.
did absolutely everything right.
Well, that's good.
Don't start with six.
What? What you saying around? That is the 24th, right?
Yes, it is.
Oh, there's Tucker. Now, did we lose Isabella? Does anybody know? Anybody know Isabella Serma? She missed Wednesday and she's missing today. Hope she's not sick. Okay, so I think we had, hopefully for you, it was for me, an interesting and productive discussion on Swell Wednesday. I'm always happy to take questions. And I said I was going to try to expand a little bit more on the dominant narrative of Zionism, which is very complex. And that's what I hope to do this morning. But again, anybody have a question or comment or concern? You think we're okay? We're okay in Dunkirk and Olean? You guys okay? Yeah. Because I was worried you weren't hearing me. You can hear me okay in Dunkirk and Olean?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, let me switch to the screen, or to the, yeah. Oh, take a minute to get the focus. I'll put it into focus. Yeah, so, sure. So I keep talking to you about the 2 different narratives, the dominant one from top down, which comes out of Zionism, and then the Palestine one, which I like to call the emerging one, which is coming up from the bottom up from the people. And that I like arrows, but hopefully my arrows aren't confusing you. I remember once on a student evaluation, it was a long time ago, somebody said I use arrows too much. I don't even know what that means. And psychologically, it's interesting if when males, and I identify as male, use arrows, we're supposedly asserting our masculinity. I don't know. I don't know if you guys are studying psychology. At least I acknowledge it. So, you've got the dominant narrative not acknowledging the emerging narrative and rejecting it, pushing back. But in one sense, talking about two narratives is somewhat simplistic because the dominant one is actually much more complicated. And to be fair to the Zionist perspective, I want to spend a little time expanding on that. So that's what I'm going to try to do this morning. In the meantime, continue to do the reading. One of the things we're going to have to talk about is in anticipation of the simulation where we pay the Palestinian Authority. I probably won't start talking about that until Monday, because usually by next week, with the holiday gone, getting into the third week, the dust is settled and we can move ahead. So anything about these two themes or narratives before I go ahead and take this one and break it down a little further? You think we're okay? Okay. So Zionism has a long and complicated history. Zion simply means Jerusalem. And Zionism dates itself to somewhere in the late 1800s, sometime after the American Civil War. And there were American Zionists, and there were Zionists in other parts of the world. And with time, Zionism became complicated because within Zionism, if you will, there's dueling narratives. So within Palestine, we have the dueling narratives, but then in Zionism itself, we have the dueling narratives. And as I said, Zion just means Jerusalem. Spell it. And I think the one that I'm going to talk to you about first is the way I understand it is the one that started, and then the other one was later. And then eventually the earlier one, which is still there, I would argue, but not the way the dominant one. So we have a dominant narrative even here. Now, when I talk about the dueling narratives over Palestine, I talk about the dominant and emerging. Here, I guess we call this one the dominant or surviving one, if you will. And the other one faded away. I would still argue to you that in one way it's there. So I'll just call it fading. And it's the subservient one. And I'll start with the fading one because it's the historical one. And one way to understand the difference between the two is that this one is sometimes called the general narrative, and this one is called the particular narrative. And I'll explain that. The general one deals with people who consider themselves to be Jewish worldwide, and is not based necessarily on the practice of the religion called Judaism. And it's an identity that people have to Jewish culture, but it could be to the religion. So in some sense, this one's more secular, although there are religious Jews in that historical one. And I probably should, because I prefer to call it the historical one, meaning that it came first. And there are people, so it's based on a Jewish identity that could be religious, but it isn't necessarily. And so there are secular Jews, or what we would call Reform Jews, as opposed to Orthodox Jews. And it deals with what is called the worldwide diaspora, which is a term to suggest that Jewish people may have come out of the Middle East, had a lot of folks in Europe and Russia, but then eventually spread throughout the world. And so the historical notion of Zionism is concerned about worldwide Judaism or Jewish identity, and wants to spread the notion of social justice throughout the world. So when you get into these narratives, there's some sense that both of them regard being Jewish as special, and any kind of religion or ethnic group often does that. And there's certainly nothing necessarily wrong with that, but that it's the duty, if you will, of Jews under the historical notion of Zionism to spread social justice throughout the world, which often uses, a reference to truth, and it's for the benefit of all. Not just all Jews, but all people. Now, it doesn't mean they're trying to convert you to Judaism. If you want to, you can, but there's so many secular Jews in this group that they're not going to do that. So their understanding of being Jewish is that we're in a special situation because we have a duty to work towards social justice and truth worldwide for all Jews and all mankind, so that we can bring about peace and understanding. It's really quite noble. So it doesn't matter what country you're in, what culture you're in, what profession you have, what line of work, none of that matters. It doesn't matter if you go to temple or not, but we have a duty to achieve justice for all. So, if you look at it in the context of American politics, for example, many Jewish people in America, however they may identify that way, because sometimes it's religious and sometimes it's not, tend to be on the left side, that is the liberal side of the spectrum. Because it's the liberal side that argues that we have a duty and obligation to help everybody. And so you find a lot of Jews on the left side, especially the historical narrative, because one, the left side tends to be more secular than the conservative or right side. And there's this notion that it's not enough to take care of ourselves and take care of our families and take care of our friends. We have a duty to work towards social justice for all. So if you go back, this has had an amazing effect. If you go back to the 1960s, 50s, during the Civil Rights era in the United States, a lot of the people allied with African Americans were Jews. Now, it can also come out of this, but I don't want to go into that yet, but there's this notion that however you identify as Jewish, you could say, well, what does it mean to be Jewish? They're saying it could be that you go to temple and your kids are bar mitzvah and you do all that stuff, but it doesn't have to. The sine qua non, the thing that essentially makes us at our core Jews, is that we have a duty to achieve justice, and we have a duty to achieve justice for everybody. And so they're not particularly concerned with the establishment of a Jewish state in the Middle East, in the former Palestine, because it's our job to talk and reach all, and that's our duty. And again, I think it's very noble. And some of this appears on this side, but in a different context. The problem with this particular version of Zionism is that it doesn't quite fit in with the way Israel is treating Palestinians. And so you get Jewish people, both in Israel, in Europe, and in the United States, who take the perspective that the problem with Israel is that it doesn't live up to this idea. Because if it's all people, then why are you treating Palestinians differently than full Israeli citizens? Why do you have different license plates? Why do you have a wall? Why do you need permits if you're a Palestinian to do stuff and you don't need it if you're non-Palestinian and you're a Jewish citizen? Why did you move people off their land? So that in the terms of social justice and truth for all people, it doesn't fit in this. So you have Jews today in Israel, Europe, and the United States probably do not call themselves Zionists because Zionism has become identified with this. So, but that's basically what it is. And Zionism is often used as a derogatory term. So people who often are anti-Israel, and there certainly are people who are anti-Israel, or anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, often denounce them as Zionists, and they don't mean that in a nice way. The problem with that is that if you understand this narrative, being called a Zionist would be flattering, because it says, I care about all of mankind. I care about all people. And it's kind of like Martin Luther King, you know, if one of us doesn't have his rights, then all of us don't have his rights. You know, and Martin Luther King talked like that. That was a Zionist perspective as originally understood. As long as one person is discriminated against or doesn't have his rights, then we don't have social justice. And Martin Luther King felt the need, you know, from a Christian perspective to advance that cause. And it's kind of unfortunate that this understanding of Zionism is gone away, because people, when they want to attack Israel, say the problem with Israel is not that it's a Jewish state, it's a Zionist state. I don't mind Jewish people having a homeland, but I don't want Zionists to have a homeland. So this one, which is really quite, holding hands in kumbaya, slowly but surely faded in response to the other one, which sometimes appears angry, nasty, and in its worst features, ugly. So this one's still around, but this one is, there I go again with my arrows, sorry. This one's been pushed aside for lots of different reasons. And so when I say general, their goal was not to create a Jewish homeland. They didn't necessarily have an objection to that, but that wasn't their goal, because if you only have justice for Jews in Israel, what about the rest of the world? Well, this one doesn't say you don't care, but this one, when I say it's particular, it's they wanted to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and they would use the word Palestine, so that we can achieve social justice and truth for the Jewish people who would come back to the homeland. And so whereas this group says, no, you got to deal with worldwide Judaism, the dominant surviving particular view of Zionism says, no, you have to bring them into the homeland. So if you're a Jew and you're outside, it's not that we don't care, but we're not going to do anything necessarily for you. If you want to enjoy social justice and truth, and you want to get that benefit of peace, you come to the homeland. And so, till this day, Jews who can establish, and I don't know I think with Judaism, it goes through the mother, not through the father. But if you can establish, and I think it's still with grandparents, if you can establish the right connection to your grandmother as a Jew, you have what's called the right to return. Doesn't matter where you are, doesn't matter if your grandmother was born someplace else. Under Israeli law, if you can effectively establish your Jewish credentials through the matrilineal line, you have a right to go to the Jewish homeland, and based on that, claim your Israeli citizen, and boom, it's granted to you. You know, now, unlike the Palestinians, who they may be able to prove that their family never lived anyplace else, but they can't automatically claim full Israeli citizenship. You're still considered, I guess, a conquered, occupied people, even though your family may have lived there forever, you know, the 4,000 years of Palestinian history. So it excludes people. It excludes the Jews who don't want to go back, and lots of Jews don't want to go back, even though they're supportive of Israel, even though they may have visited it. And it excludes Palestinians who may have lived there all their life. And so you have the right to return. And it's interesting, when I flew over to Tel Aviv on Delta Airlines, I don't know where we flew out of, I can't remember anymore. Maybe it was New York, New Jersey, I don't remember. But the plane was filled with young Jewish people, men and women, probably around your age. And they get a paid trip by the Israeli government. So they reach out to the diaspora, and these might be kids whose great-grandparents never set foot in Israel. And they have a right to go back on a trip. And I don't know if the trip's a week or 10 days, I don't even know. And these young people are met at the airport and shown everything that's good about Israel. They completely ignore Palestine and try to entice these young people as part of the Jewish diaspora to return to the Jewish homeland. Because if you're fourth generation living in the United States, you need to come back. And so they go all out. And they speak to they hire other young Israeli university students to talk to these students, to tell them why, even if they can't speak Hebrew, even if they have no thought about it, but you gotta come back, this is your homeland. Now, my grandparents came from Poland, and I visited Poland, but I mean, the Polish government doesn't offer me the opportunity to go back. Of course, you know, they couldn't when I was young because they were under the control of the communists, but they don't offer young Polish people the chance to come back and say, well, you really got to come back to the homeland. You know, I don't want to live in Poland, although I really enjoy visiting it. So I don't have the right to return. This is really quite unique. And then while you're there, it's also very interesting because they deliberately select the best looking young men and women. It's sort of like, see, if you come to Israel, you know, you're young, your hormones are going, you're looking for a partner or whatever else you're looking for. Look at how beautiful we are. It's also interesting that when they're met by the Israeli Defense Forces, the military, they always pick the best looking men and women. And it's interesting too, because in a heavily touristed site like Jerusalem, one of the things I noticed is the military, both the men and the women, were extraordinary. They were like models. I'm thinking, you know, obviously there are people in Israel who aren't model material, but at the tourist sites, they were all super attractive. It's sort of like this fake image. Come back and you too can get married or have a relationship with a beautiful young Israeli. And to the credit of Israel, they do this for both straight and gay people. So you can occasionally come across an ad for why, you know, Tel Aviv is like the gayest city in the world, and if you're gay, you should go visit it. And so in one sense, it's kind of good because they don't discriminate based on sexual orientation. But it's done deliberately, and it's called pinkwashing. Now, I don't know how this sits with the Orthodox Jews who are in control, but the Israeli tourist agencies, the government does what we call pinkwashing. And what it says is, Israel is not just for straight people, because it's for gay people. And so if you're a lesbian or a gay man, we have beautiful young lesbian and gay men, and they live with full rights. And they play this angle up. I've seen the ads; they're amazing. With the rainbow flag and everything, and men holding hands and women dancing together. Say, like Israel is this golden paradise if you're gay or lesbian. So you ought to come here. And the accusation made by lots of different people, including this group, the Palestinians, and many LGBTQ advocates, is that, well, it may be okay, and it may be a good place to be, but you're using our identity to ignore the Palestinian identity. So we present ourselves as this liberal, pro-human rights state because, look how we treat gay people. We treat gay people here better than in the United States or other parts of the world. And so, obviously we're pro-human rights, but they've been accused of using it as a smokescreen because it's primarily directed at the young Jews who have a right to return, and it then says it's used as a smokescreen to don't look at the wall, don't look at the Palestinians, don't look at the license plates because this is the only country where if you're a young Jew and you're gay, you can live the best life possible. And so lots of LGBTQ activists won't go there because although it is very gay friendly, gay beaches and where people can be free, which is wonderful. But lots of people resent it because it's hiding the truth about how other people are being treated. And so that's why we call it pinkwashing. It's maybe we can wash away the stain of the Palestinians if we can show how liberal we are. And of course, this brings in more Jews because demographically, the Palestinian birth rate is outpacing the Jewish birth rate. So at some point, the Jewish state, however it exists, their percentage of the population of Palestine will be in the minority. And so how do you change that? You do that with the right of return and pinkwashing. Now, if you're a Palestinian, if you saw the sign that we put up for the course, there's a skeleton key. Probably all of you are too young to remember skeleton keys. I mean, my grandmother had one in her house. They're not particularly good for security, but when Palestinians got thrown out of their homes because the Israeli Defense Force or the settlers took the homes and often demolished them, the only thing the Palestinians had left was that key. And lots of Palestinians will have a skeleton key on their keychain. A lot of people who are pro-Palestine will have a skeleton key. And it's to show that it's a form of protest. It's saying, well, we have the right of return too, because we were there and you moved us out of our homes and you bulldozed our village. And some of us ran away, some of us stayed, but you put us behind this wall. And the key is the Palestinians saying it's a silent protest. We have the right to return. So I remember the vice president here, when we started up in August, she had a slide with the skeleton key. And after we got all done, I sent her an email. And I said, well, gee, I didn't realize you were pro-Palestine. Thank you very much. And she really didn't know what she was doing. So I said, well, that's the symbol for a full nation state and full Palestinian rights is the skeleton key. And so she thanked me for educating her. But if you ever when I see a skeleton key, that's what I think of. The right, as a Palestinian, I'm not Palestinian, to live as a full citizen in my state. So this one is called particular again, because it focuses strictly on the Jewish homeland. Whereas this one, if you will, focuses on the world. This is the one that pushed this one aside, often with support of Americans and British Jews. It started with British Jews, so it comes out of Europe. And the British, as you know, or hopefully you know if you've been reading the textbook, the British were given a mandate by the League of Nations at the end of World War I to control that part of the world, and they stayed there until the late 1940s. So anybody know anything about the League of Nations? Anybody have a clue? Nobody? Oh, yes, go ahead.
You say the president's this is amazing, and then Congress said, oh, no, we're not doing that, that sucks. And
Yeah, President Wilson wanted us to join the League after the war, but the Senate refused to ratify the treaty. So the U.S. never joined the League. And the League is, today's United Nations came out of the League. So the League the League was supposed to keep peace in the world after World War I, but obviously when World War II starts in 1939, it failed. But it never went away, it just sat there. And then when the United Nations was created by the United States in 1945, it was built on the foundation of the League, only President Truman made sure that we joined. So President Wilson wanted us to join, but the Senate said no. So it comes out of the Versailles Treaty, which was the treaty that ended World War I. It was negotiated at Versailles in France. President Wilson was there, but at the end of his second term, he got quite ill and he just wasn't thinking clearly, and he kind of blew it. And so the United States never signed on to the Versailles Treaty. We entered into a separate treaty with Germany, which was setting the tone and the beginnings of World War II, because the Versailles Treaty treated Germany harshly. The Germans, when they signed the treaty, had to say that World War I was their fault, and they had to pay reparations back to the other countries. And it basically set up all the things that happened to eventually bring about Adolf Hitler in World War II. But one of the things that came out of it was that the British got what the League of Nations, they invented a term, they called it the British Mandate, which meant that there were parts of the world that didn't belong to any nation state, and therefore the victorious allies were given control of these different parts of the world. The United States, of course, is not in this because we didn't sign the treaty. And the British were given what we would call Palestine. So they got the Palestinian Mandate, in part because the British were involved in their prior World War I, in part because of the Suez Canal that runs through Egypt, which the British needed to keep moving their troops and their ships around. So it was helpful for the British to have a military presence in Palestine to keep an eye on the canal. And then, of course, the other resource, what would be the other resource that the British would want from the Middle East to fight the war? Yeah, oil. So the British wanted to be there, one, to protect people from causing trouble on the Suez Canal, because the British made their fortune by trading by sea, and because they needed the oil, not just to fight the war, but to fuel their economy back in England. So the British were heavily involved, And in fact, during the war, the British worked very hard to get the Arabs on their side to fight against Germany in the war. And so they actually made a promise at one point, which they never lived up to, that they would help the Arabs of the Middle East, and they would refer to them as Arabs, not Palestinians. They would help the Arabs of the world establish independent nation states, which eventually becomes like Syria and Iraq, but then didn't include Palestine itself because they needed to have that presence there. And so the Zionists knew that the British were probably going to end up with control of the Palestinian Mandate. So the Zionists, both from the Middle East, other parts of Europe, and England, convinced the British government in 1917 to issue what's called the Balfour Declaration. Balfour was the name of the foreign minister. And the Zionists convinced they worked from the inside out. So the Palestinians at this point are not particularly well organized, although the Arabs of the region got more organized as a result of the war. And it's, I often go back between Palestinians and Arabs, because while there has always been a Palestinian people, like that one book will tell you, for 4,000 years, how you identify doesn't come about in that part of the world until actually during the British Mandate in response to the Zionists. So a lot of Arabs who always lived there started calling themselves Palestinians, but then their identity as Palestinians comes about so late that they never had the influence over the British government. The Zionists figured out, well, they're going to get the mandate, we're going to get them to issue this declaration. And the declaration, although it went through various different iterations, basically said that the British government promises a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, the problem is, what does homeland mean? Does it mean a nation state? Does it mean a city within another nation state? Does it mean equal rights in a different country? Does it mean culturally religious? One suggestion, and it's a very complicated history, one suggestion was made that it was written this way, deliberately ambiguous. So the British didn't necessarily understand that they were promising the Jews a country, because the Zionists knew that if it said a Jewish nation state, it probably would never get past the British Parliament. So they were very clever at negotiating. This is not unusual. In 2020, stuff is negotiated this day. Why you put in words that are ambiguous so that both sides can read into it and agree to it. So the Zionists understood this meant our own country. The British government, somewhat naively, did not understand that, although there may have been some in the British government. So, at this point, as is today, England is a monarch. So it's done in the name, at that point, in the name of the king. King George, because it's His Majesty's government, promised in the Balfour Declaration from the British government, because the government always does stuff in the name of King of Jewish homeland. And the Zionists took that as a signal to start creating a nation state. When the Palestinians figured this out, they started pushing back. But probably too little, too late. Although there were riots in the 20s, riots in the 30s, to get rid of this notion, to get rid of the British, to get rid of the Jews, who at that point are definitely in the minority, because the Palestinians were starting to fear what was going to come next. And then, of course, you got World War II involved, And again, the British made all kinds of promises. Well, if you help us defeat Germany and Italy, we'll get you a homeland. But they made promises to the Arabs, they made promises to the Jews, none of which they could possibly fulfill when the war was over. But this declaration, the Balfour Declaration, is, from the Zionist perspective, it was British, and at this point, you know, they start to fall apart after World War I because the war exhausted them. And if you get to go to the theater to see the movie 1917, I did it over the weekend, it's excellent. It's from the British perspective. It follows two soldiers. It's really good. Did anybody go to it? It's not particularly gory, but if you get a chance, go like over the weekend. It's worth it. Especially if you don't know that much about World War I. Pretty ugly war. But one of the things that comes out of it is this infamous, if you're a Palestinian, Balfour Declaration, or if you're a Zionist on this side, that's where you say that was the world recognizing Jewish people's right, based on the Bible, to go back and settle Judea and Samaria. Because again, the Zionists never call that Palestine, never call it the West Bank. It's the biblical promise of Jews going back to Judea and Samaria. So again, if you're Palestinian, this is infamous, and they blame the British. But I think the British didn't understand what they were getting into in their defense. And one of the major proponents of this whole approach was none other than Winston Churchill, who eventually, of course, becomes the Prime Minister of England when they defeat the Nazis. And Churchill, to a great extent, until he becomes Prime Minister, is really a pretty big failure. He screws up an awful lot of stuff, but he was a survivor. And he did an excellent job in keeping the British going during the darkest days of World War II. And Churchill at one point had the title of colonial secretary. Secretary doesn't mean someone who types. You know, it's just like in the United States, we have a Secretary of State. In the cabinet, when his party was in power, he was the colonial secretary. Now notice colonial, because the British at this point still had a worldwide empire. And the job of the colonial secretary was to keep that worldwide empire under control, which included the Middle East, and included, when necessary, using British troops to put down the native peoples who didn't want the British there anymore. And Churchill, for all of his virtues, is like the poster boy for colonialism. He pretty much hated everybody unless you were American, because his mother was an American. If you were a white American British Protestant, then his perspective is that that was the superior civilization. And then it's the job of England to spread white Protestant parliamentarian form of government to the uncivilized parts of the world. So Churchill would say India should not have independence because they're uncivilized. Palestine needs to be under our control because the Palestinian people aren't civilized. But I got to keep an eye on that. But this colonial perspective is not unique to Britain. You know, when the British set up the 13 colonies in America, they saw themselves, but this would be true with the French in Canada, the Spanish in Florida, the Portuguese in Brazil. We are spreading civilization, which always was based on Christianity or their understanding of it, to the heathens of the world. So the United States started out as a colonial place whereby the British, and then the French in Canada, the Spanish in Florida, the Portuguese in Brazil, exterminated lots of Native Americans, what we might today call indigenous persons, to establish a British colony. And, the only way you can do that, especially if you do it in the name of Christianity, is to regard these people as uncivilized, unwashed, dirty, primitive. They have no culture. They're not a people. And so when you hear Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, saying about the Palestinians, there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. It's a colonial mentality to justify pushing people who have always been there out of the way. So the Brits come over here and push the Indians out of the way, and lots of Indians die, both being shot, killed. There were missionaries who often, in the name of different empires, said, convert to Jesus or we're going to kill you. Now, I would argue that that's not Christianity, but that was their understanding. And then when the heathens, the uncivilized, the unwashed, the uncultured flocked back to save their culture, the colonialists were always surprised. Like, why wouldn't you want to accept Christianity and learn to read English? I mean, look at all these benefits we're bringing you. So we're civilizing you, we're bringing you benefits, but not this way. We're forcing it on you because we view you as being inferior. And so we're here to save you. And you shoot back. You don't show gratitude for us forcing you to live the way we do. Well, that's very much a colonial mentality. So then the United States has independence, but then what do? We continue the westward march in the name of manifest destiny to get rid of the Indians, or what we would have called the Indians. So, President Jackson, President Trump's favorite president, had a deliberate genocide policy of removing the Indians to make way for the white settlers. And the Indians can stay if they want to become civilized. And if they don't, we'll push you out of the way. And if necessary, we'll kill you. And so we have the Indians being forcefully removed from their land and pushed west of the Mississippi, although that didn't guarantee anything because then we kept pushing and pushing and pushing. America, the United States of America, is a colonial country. Now, you would think we broke with an empire, but we are basically have that European attitude. Christianity is better, being white is better. That's why we can justify keeping black people in slavery. That's why there was historically a great deal of anti-Catholic bias in this country, still exists. And we just pushed everybody out of the way. And we kept Indian names like Chautauqua, Cattaraugus. Those are Indian names. So the places, now the Israelis, when they do this, and they push the Palestinians out of the way, they take us even further because they erase the Arabic names and impose Hebrew names. So they go even farther. So American support of Israel as a colonial state, which is what it is, done in the name of this form of Zionism, is not, in that sense, inconsistent because this country was colonial. We pushed people out of the way. Or in the case of blacks, we used them to make us wealthy. So England is a colonial society. The United States is a colonial society. So in one sense, our support of Israel as a colonial settlement is totally logical. It isn't just about Jews and Jews voting in key electoral states, although that matters. It's, well, why wouldn't a colonial state, the United States of America, support another colonial state, Israel? Because there were natives people here. We live in New York. The Senate of the Iroquois Confederacy controlled New York State in peace and prosperity for 500 years. The United States hasn't even made, well, we're a little over 200, and had a culture and had peace. But rather than try to understand it, we just said, well, you're dirty, inferior, and uncivilized, and we're going to save you, and if you don't want to be saved, we're going to kill you. The only American who had any real understanding of the importance of Native culture was Benjamin Franklin. He spent a lot of time with Indians, but he was a lone voice in the wilderness. So Churchill has this identity, and you get to the end of World War II, and he says, I can't let the Indians leave the empire. They're incapable of ruling themselves. The reason the British finally give up in Palestine after World War II is because the British were exhausted financially by the war and could no longer afford to control Palestine. And the constant tension, the Jews were attacking the British, Palestinians were attacking the British, saying, get the hell out of here. And then they were fighting among themselves. And the British said, we can't control this. Here's the date we're leaving, goodbye, good luck. It was totally irresponsible, because they were given the mandate. That term mandate was invented by the League of Nations. And it was a term to help empires take control of territory that wasn't a country, it didn't belong to anybody. The British thought they could rule it in peace, but the Balfour Declaration destroyed that, because these Zionists misread it. Politically, it was very clever. They were geniuses. But then with that, this becomes the goal. This form of Zionism survives and is still alive and well in Israel. And this one fades, although it's still around. So you are Zionists who say, this has nothing to do with this. And we never should have done that. We should return to this. But Palestinians would say, yeah, that's Zionism, it's okay with us. But they said, not this. This is a colonial mentality. We weren't, and I know I'm running out of time, we're not uncivilized. We are a people, we have a culture, we've been here for 4,000 years. Who are you to come and push us aside? So, well, if you have any questions, I guess you'll have to ask on Small Monday, but this stuff is so complex. And as I mentioned to you when we first started this isn't just about that little tiny piece of land. It's literally about the world. That's why it has the potential to turn into a worldwide conflict, but I probably said enough. So I'll see you on, when do I see you? Small Monday. Monday. Today's Friday, right? I get so wrapped up in this stuff. Well, enjoy your weekend. Go to 1917. It's worthwhile. I know it's playing here. I don't know about